And we're live.
Yay. Hello.
Hey everyone, I am so thrilled to be moderating this panel as part of the series of Orbit's Pride Month events. And today we're going to be chatting with three lovely authors, Tara Sim, author of The City of Dusk, and M.A. Carrick, which is the joint pen name for two authors, for Marie Brennan and Alice Helms. Just so you know, this Orbit Pride series is presented with queer SFF, so sci-fi fantasy bookstores. So in the US, we have Tubby and Coo's Mid-City Bookshop. And then in the UK, we have Portal Bookshop. So there's a button below the video where you can buy these books. And additionally, just so you know, there is a Q&A at the end of this live, or well, not at the end, but before the end of the live. So definitely make sure to ask questions and also vote for your favorite ones as well, because that helps us see them. And that will make sure that you get it answered, or not make sure you get answered, but a little bit higher chance that they will get answered. So before we begin, I'm just going to talk a little bit about our panelists. So my name is Lili, and I go by she and her, and I am the book reviewer on the internet known as Utopia State of Mind, where I mostly talk about SFF books. So joining me is Tara Sim, also she, her, the author of The City of Dusk, the first book in her Dark Gods series. Tara is also the author of several YA fantasy books, including Scavenge the Stars and Timekeeper. The City of Dusk is her first adult fantasy novel. And as well, as I said before, the joint pen name of M.A. Carrick breaks down into Marie Brennan and Alice Helms. Their Rook and Rose trilogy began with The Mask of Mirrors. The Liar's Knot, the second book of the series, is also available. So let's get into some questions that I had for these fantastic authors. The first one that I wanted to chat about is that in fantasy worlds, especially secondary ones, authors have the ability to make their own rules. And I want to know, could you talk about how you created your world and specifically its queerness? Was this way you approached queerness a conversation that occurred or something that was, a conscious choice? How did this sort of happen? Because I've read a lot of book reviews about all of the, both of these books in the book series, chatting specifically about that. So I wanted to talk about that and give those people, a little bit of moment in the sun, I guess.
Yeah, I'll start on that because with you saying, was it a conversation? Yes, because when you're collaborating, everything is a conversation. Like you've always got to be discussing your plans. But this one, I will say specifically, credit to Alice for being the one who kind of started that particular conversation and, brought that up as a thing for us to put into the story. For both of us, we both come from an anthropology background academically. And so the world building side, I probably shouldn't call the series What Anthropologists Attack, but I keep doing it. And so that affected how we approached it in a couple of ways. One was that partly we were looking to, what are the ways that this has been incorporated into real cultures? Because you still sometimes run into, people who seem to think that, putting queerness into a world is a purely fantasy thing. And I'm like, no, that is in fact a real thing. So certainly we weren't only keeping ourselves limited to what's existed, in the real world, but we were taking some of our ideas from that, like the ways in which, like trans identity manifests in Versenian culture. Some of the ideas from that came from like Albanian sworn virgins and things like that. But we also really look at, okay, if this is part of the culture, then what are the effects that's going to have? And this comes up with like the same-sex relationships, where there are people who are married to someone of the same sex, and given that marriage historically has often been less about love and desire and more about having heirs to inherit your property, like that's really what has driven marriage for most of human history. So how does inheritance work if you have two people married to each other who are not going to be able to procreate with each other? And part of the answer for that was that not everywhere has it been as dependent on the sort of English phrase was heirs of your body. Like it doesn't necessarily have to be a blood descendant of yours. I know historically, I don't know how common this still is, but historically in Japan, it was not unusual to adopt a guy to be your heir. Like maybe he would marry your daughter to get him into the family. But like if you had no sons or your son was incompetent or something, you could just adopt an heir. And so we said, all right, that's a model that makes sense. But the other thing for us, and this was both like a blessing and a curse, is that because Nadezhra is a colonized city, everything we world built, we had to do at least twice. Because we had to go, how do the Versenians do it? How do the Leganti do it? And then depending on the topic, there's, some hybridized Nadezhran version that comes out of that. But in this respect, I think it was really helpful because they do these things in different ways. They do like transness in different ways. They do same-sex relationships in different ways. And so it means that we were able within our own story to contrast with ourselves and say, it's not that this is the perfect, complete answer. It's the answer that this culture has, and this other culture does it differently, and there are other possibilities besides the ones we're showing you.
That's such a smart answer that I feel really like I don't want to follow that one.
Well, I can actually talk a little bit about one of our shortcomings, I think, and it's something we are aware of, but because we have two cultures that are both kind of deeply steeped in conceptual binaries, the faces and masks, etc. Yeah. We don't actually have a lot of culturally defined space for non-binary and third genders. Yeah. And this doesn't mean that they don't exist. For example, I consider Oksana Revchek to be someone who's genderqueer because she just trounces all over the binary. But it is an illustration of how culture prescribes gender roles and identities along certain often unexamined biases. And we've already talked about if we ever get to explore more of the world, we're definitely have got plans and ideas for cultures that do create space for those gender identities beyond the binary.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
That's really cool. I did not have a historical slant to my world building in that regard. I was just like, everyone's gay and everyone's fine. It's fine. I think it just came from a place of just being so tired of having to, because there have even been books where even though they are queer books, they still have to deal with the fact that queerness is not accepted in their specific worlds. And I'm like, that's fine. We do need books like that kind of more reflect the real world. But for my secondary world fantasies, I just don't want that. And so it's just kind of like a natural thing now for me to just create worlds that are just open and accepting of literally everyone. So for example, even in my, Scavenge series, there's non-binary folks are just widely regarded as oh, you're wearing this specific symbol that means that I'm going to call you, they, them. And then in the City of Dusk world, what you were talking about with marriage and stuff, I do have a main character who has two mothers, but it's a second marriage. So her first was for heir purposes, but then when he passed away, she remarried to a woman. So I do kind of think about stuff in that regard, especially when it comes to royalty and nobility.
Yeah.
Yeah. It does get a little there. But like you said, adoption, wards, that kind of stuff is it's all good. It's all good in my world and nobody gets hurt because of it.
Yeah.
I guess it's just me wanting a safe space for readers. So them knowing that even though there are definitely bad things that are going to happen in this book, it's not because you're gay. It's just because your morals are weird.
Yeah, I say with the queer normative approach, it's it sort of makes me sad when you get this feeling of, okay, all the worlds still have the oppression and such, where we can imagine all kinds of wondrous things, but we can't imagine worlds where maybe that oppression isn't part of it. I agree with you that it's good to have stories that explore the oppression and deal with it, but it's also good to have the ones that just go, what if we didn't?
Yeah. They have so many other problems to deal with. Why should this be one of them?
Yeah.
Yeah. I love those. Yeah, I just after the first answer from Marie, I also was like, wow, that is such an intelligent way.
I told Alyssa I wanted to take point on that one because I was like, ooh, I could actually do a good answer. The next one, I'm just going to be like, Alyssa, do you have anything? Because I got nothing.
Yeah. I did also want to mention that I think that as I was reading the bios, because I was making sure that I was doing my job, I think that I also forgot everyone else's pronoun because I was so worried that I didn't have mine in my bio. So in case I did forget that, because of course now I'm like panicking that I did or didn't forget it. So Tara goes by she, her, Alice goes they, them, and then Marie goes she, her. So I wanted to remember if I did that. If I did it before,
I honestly can't remember either, so.
Yeah. If I did before, it just happened twice. That's fine. I wanted to, on that vein as well, I wanted to talk about the inclusivity of the queer characters in your books. I did mention before in my first question that it was something that I read about in a lot of different reviews, as I was kind of picking other people's review brains to see what everyone else wanted to really know. And so that was a common thread that I kept seeing as well. I think I said in the first question, but I was seeing it for both of these questions that I had. So I wanted to know what it was like to write these characters, and what were your character inspirations?
Tara.
Yeah, we
take point if you want.
I mean, I've just have loved character development for as long as I can remember. And originally, when I was like first in development of this world, I was like, oh, you know, I already knew that I was going to be like queer normative, but it was more in the vein of like, oh, everyone's bi, whatever. But then like as I grew to like learn about the different characters, I'm like, well, no, that's not true. Like this one is definitely a lesbian. This one is, you know, definitely trans, you know, that kind of stuff. And, you know, sometimes even learning about them and their identities while I was writing them. So like some of them I kind of like came in knowing like, okay, Tasia, definitely chaotic bisexual woman. Like that is just who she is. It's always who she has been. But then I actually didn't realize that Risha was ace until like several drafts on. And I was like, this makes a lot of sense for you. So I feel like a lot of my development comes with the drafting process and being like, okay, so like I've got your voice, but now I need to like know what your morals are, or like I know what your morals are. But also like I need to find out like what's the wound that you have to address. Like what are your external and internal conflicts and stuff like that. And I feel like my approach to them wasn't so much that it spun around their identities. It was just that their identities just existed alongside them. You know, they're just, I don't want to say regular people because they're not regular normal people, but they're just, you know, going about their lives the way that they normally would until, you know, catastrophe and whatever. So my development for them was less about like really like digging into identity in that specific sense, rather than them just living in their truth, if that makes sense.
I think that makes sense. Well, and it's funny because I think for us it's very similar. I think both of these I feel like are very character driven fantasies, as much as there's like a lot of, you know, world building and all that other stuff. Mm-hmm. I feel like I got the feeling from City of Dusk, and I know for us that the character and the character relationships are really the core of what we were building around. And I'm going to be threading a needle on figuring out what I can say without being spoilery.
Yeah.
But we mentioned elsewhere that the seed for these books came out of a tabletop RPG that I ran that Marie was a player in. And her PC, her player character, Ren, was a con artist who, with the help of her sister, Tess, was pulling this long con on a noble house. Sound familiar? So I'm pretty well known among my friends as having ship goggles like permanently attached to my face. And for me, pretty much every character I create is going to be some flavor of bi, pan, queer, genderqueer, because I've always been a bit gender what. And I'm also the sort of person who didn't realize for an embarrassingly long amount of time that I was not straight, because I just thought everybody could look at anybody and potentially be attracted. And it's become more complicated since then, but yeah, that's a good thing. But in creating allies and antagonists for Ren, I wanted to explore the two routes her character could go down: the selfless hero route, as represented by Grace Serrato, or the ruthless ambition route, as represented by Derasi Vargo. And because these were also intended to be possible romances that would hook Marie, both of them had to be men who were attracted to women. Gray, because he put his duty and above like kind of personal interest and stuff, he ended up being almost somewhat gray sexual, gray romantic in my head, because any attraction or romance with Ren grew out of their mutual dedication and trust as they kind of built that between them. Vargo, I'll admit, took some of the aspects of the evil bisexual trope.
But it's such a good trope when done well.
It's a great trope when done and when done well. And one of my kind of things was, but what if not evil, yes, bisexual. And his attraction for Ren grows out of seeing her as his equal and partner, and seeing her as someone who can kind of keep up with him, and so that they together could become the city's big power couple, which is what is important to him. And I remember at one point, Marie asked me who he might end up with if he didn't couple up with Ren, and that led me to realize that Vargo didn't look for that sort of thing. That he was aromantic, and that conversation was when I kind of, like what Tara was saying, is I had the discovery that I was like, oh right, Vargo's aromantic.
Yeah.
It wasn't something I decided. It was because like we knew his character well enough at that point that I could be like, no, this is what he wants, and this is what he values, and this is kind of how he sees himself. And he's got deep and meaningful relationships, sexual, friendly, and familial, but romance just isn't something that he wants or needs.
Now, the one thing I'll add to that is, I think, Alyssa, to some extent, there may be a little bit of what we know now about the character sort of back writing itself onto the game, because I remember me coming to you and going, very early when we were working on planning, or maybe had just started writing The Mask of Mirrors, and I was like, it would really work well for me if Vargo was bisexual, because I'm not sure game version of him necessarily was, except that the conversation we had was just kind of a, yeah, he is. Like, we sort of realized that about him. Yeah. I don't know that that was planned into him from the start so much as a thing that once we said it, we went, yeah, I think that's always been true. And it kind of back-wrote itself onto how we conceive of the game version of the character too, because I remember the conversation.
Yeah, and I do know that we had certain like tweaks and kind of adjustments, including both of us kind of taking ownership of all the characters, and rather than there being that kind of split between them. But yeah, I think kind of like what Tara was saying, I think we generally think of characters through their roles and relationships, rather than deciding on a gender or sexuality beforehand and then building someone to fit.
Yeah.
And I agree. I think that leads to characters feeling natural and well-rounded, and with their gender and the sexuality being facets of who they are rather than kind of defining them.
Though I will say, I think, kind of from a craft standpoint, that approach works when you've got the possibilities for queerness already embedded enough in your mind that they might grow organically into something. If it's not part of how you think in the first place, then going that route tends to mean that you just don't even remember to put that in. That you just go with your defaults. And so if it's something where it's not like one that I remember we changed early on for the books as well, that Elise, you had said that you wanted Pavlin to be trans, and that had not originally been true with the character. And that was something where, I don't know what your thought process was in getting to that, but I feel like that was maybe more of a conscious, like, let's put this in here, and then the character grows around it. So, yeah, I mean, there are pitfalls to let me just see what naturally grows out of their relationships, because if the only relationships you think up for them are, the kind of normative ones, then the other possibilities won't end up in there.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I always had a good idea of like who was going to end up with who, like end game. And so that kind of helped me a lot with figuring out like their identities and like which way they were going to, go.
And I think also,
I don't even know.
Because we brought up the evil bisexual thing, I think there was a little bit of consciously saying, okay, who else in the story can be bi, to make it clear that this character's morality is not linked to their sexuality. Like, a very sweet, innocent cinnamon roll who, is figured out what she wants out of life in general. And that's a very different character from Vargo or from Rivchak or whoever.
Yeah, like Tasia and Nick are my two bi characters, and they are completely different. One of them is, she kills people, and the other one is just a very sad boy.
Yeah, and this is just, for representation of any kind, one of the biggest things that helps with it is have more than one of whatever.
More than one,
because then you can show that, okay, it's not that all X are like this.
Yeah, I think that's also a really good segue to my next question, which was going to be for Mask of Mirrors, specifically about co-writing and sort of how you approach that process, and specifically also in relation to the characters. And you are already touching on it as well, which was really fascinating to hear, like the beginning of that conversation, and about having these like ongoing conversations about characters and sort of how do they develop when you're writing with two people.
Yeah. So we write in Google Docs so that because we trade back and forth during the course of, a given scene. And so we've got a chat window going and I'll say tag when I've written a bit and then Alyssa writes and says tag. But one of the things we do, and I've posted these on our website for the Mask of Mirrors, I haven't yet put up the ones for the Liar's Knot, are the marginal notes. Like we put comments on the doc for each other. And some of them are things like, make sure to check this with what we said before, or, fix it once we've worked out the timing. Some of them are practical. And some of them are comments about like, and suddenly I ship these two. Like we are commenting in that regard. And yeah, so there are minor characters that were like, yeah, so I just decided they're in a relationship, and we're putting comments about that in the margins to each other.
And I think also this kind of shows how much like we ended up taking co-ownership the characters of kind of meta reactions from the characters as events are happening. So
like what are their thought bubbles saying in the middle of that?
Yeah, exactly. And the fact that we can both kind of do that and know the characters well enough, have a good enough handle on the characters to be able to kind of have their reaction shots to whatever's happening to them.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love the idea of like balancing what you were saying as well before, kind of an organic evolution of characters, and then also characters and thinking about their roles and their relationships within the story. Because I think both of those are such important questions that need to be asked about characters. Switching a little bit to City of Dusk, your book has multiple perspectives, multiple POVs. And I wanted to know, how did you balance developing each of the characters kind of in relation to each other, and also like, the big story, especially as the book continues, and I guess continues, on past City of Dusk as a series.
It was difficult. There are 7 POVs in the book, 5 main ones and 2 like smaller ones that come up here and there. And my biggest like approach to it, like the most the best way for me to like weave them all together was to make sure that like their character points and the plot points like intermingled well. Yeah. There's a quote that I have written on a sticky note somewhere that's like, no plot point without character point, no character point without plot point. And that was a big thing for City of Dusk because there is so much plot and so much character that I had to make sure that they were all woven together well, and making sure that the main 4 specifically had like a good chunk of page time each, so that the readers knew where they were coming from, what their like original archetype was derived from, and how it gets kind of like splintered as the book and the series goes on. Making sure that like my twists were set up correctly by like watching things through other POVs that the other characters might not know, seeing other characters from others POVs and stuff, especially when it comes to that midpoint where they, learn this very shocking thing, and a lot of what they thought kind of gets turned on its head, and then they start looking at each other differently. So making sure that like each of them were keeping to their own thought processes and making sure like who knew what and stuff was like a bit of a balance. But like I feel like even early on I knew their voices very well, and so it was easier in that regard to make sure like I knew like, oh, here's Arisha POV, so it's going to be a little bit more like solemn, she's more like level-headed, and then it goes to Angelica and she's like, oh fuck, And so like having those voices very clearly in my head helped a lot in that regard.
I feel like we are tagged. I was just saying we're tagged in every single corner of that photo, like all of that. I'm like, yes.
Well, and I was going to say one of the things I noticed, and it impressed me because for Marie and I, we can kind of bounce back and forth, and again, we share the characters, but tends to be like she might write, a Ren POV and I might write like a Grey or a Vargo POV. And one of the things I was really impressed was I could really tell the difference between like a Risha POV and a Tasia POV. Like I thought that was really well done. So go you for
without having a second person carry some of that weight.
Without having a second person to do that.
Yeah, I was actually curious too when you were answering the previous question about co-writing, because like I have some friends who co-write as well, and they have like a slightly different system. So like between you say you share the characters. So like, do you go, like if Marie writes something, do you go and kind of like add your own little stuff to the chapter that she just wrote, or like how does that work exactly?
It came out of the fact that this started as RP. Like this actually started as, we ended up writing like 50,000 words of side fic for the game that wasn't even like the main plot of the game. And so the approach is much like RP, that with those scenes we were writing, I wrote Ren's dialogue, I wrote her actions, we were usually in her point of view because I didn't know what the NPCs were thinking. And then, so like I would write a line of dialogue and Alyssa writes the response and back and forth like it is, RP in text form. Now for the books, we've gotten more up in each other's business basically as it's gone along. We do a lot of revision. I mean, when people say that they can't see where the seams are between the bits that each of us wrote, that's because we can't find them anymore either. And there will be a lot of coordination as well of like, oh wait, hold on, before we get to that bit, I want to go and insert something else because then it'll flow more naturally to that point, all over the place.
That's incredible. Like I imagine that co-writing is like really cool, like collaboratively, but I don't do it.
You've got to find the right person to collaborate
with.
I think
it's if you find the right person, and I mean, we knew each other for close to 20 years before, and are both writers before we even kind of said, hey, maybe we should write something together. And it was really from having the RP kind of back and forth that we realized, hey, this is something we can do, and that we vibe really well together. And it's just serendipity if you can find somebody who does that with you. Yeah,
I love also what you were saying before about this call and response, basically, because I was also wondering, because that was a thing I was thinking as well when I was asking this question, because I couldn't tell if someone had been writing only one POV, and then like if it was kind of like that shift. And so it's really cool to see the synergy and realize that like how it appears so synergistically on the page is also how it seems to have happened,
We're kind of platonically romancing each other because there's always like I'll write something and be like, oh, Marie's going to love this line. Or she'll write something and she'll be like, yeah, Alyssa's going to be all up in this.
Oh, good. You liked my favorite line.
I just wanted to remind everyone as well that there's the question and answer box. We have some questions coming in as well, but I just wanted to remind people so that they get your questions in early, so we have a good chance of answering them. I wanted to ask as well that I've been overjoyed basically at like the amount of new releases and upcoming books I can add to my TBR every year for queer fantasy stories. I feel like I'm never going to catch up, and it's just going to be how I guess my life goes. So I wanted to know, of course, there's progress to be made. There's more and more books being published, but there's also questions about like conversations about rep and about, conversations within the queer space and fantasy space and everything like that. So I wanted to know, what changes or conversations do you envision happening within this space?
Well, kind of what Tara was saying, I want to see just more queerness normalized. Because it is that kind of like, I always go into something clenched up a little bit, and when I see it's normalized, I can kind of just relax into it. And that's not that I don't think there's not a place for exploring kind of contemporary challenges and of discrimination, et cetera. But I think that the more we can imagine queerness normalized in settings, the more we can kind of see it reflected in the world. And the more we'll be able to tell complicated stories about complex characters without worrying about, reworking old tropes like the evil bisexual or, bury your gays or lesbian vampires or whatever. So yeah, sort of counter to that, not quite contradicting myself, but I also want to see more exploration of cultural models of queerness that don't match kind of contemporary awareness or the kind of imagination that we have of queer sexuality and queer identity in particularly like kind of Euro history, which isn't necessarily how it actually was in Eurocentric history. But, you know, even just in existing cultures, contemporary and the past, there's so much more variation to how we understand gender identity and sexuality than our current models. And so I'd love to see more speculative realms that kind of explore that. I'd love to see an approach that isn't familiar.
You're reminding me of Star Trek Discovery. They've got a non-binary character on it, and there was just a little part of me that was so disappointed when the conversation about that non-binary character involved the "my pronouns are they them," and I'm like, you just made it feel so very much of this place at this moment at this time, and I wanted, you know, centuries in the future to have a different approach to that wasn't exactly the one we're doing right now. I agree. I'd love to see more things that are, what are other just, you know, mentalities around this, because there are many parts of the world that have different ways of thinking about it than the one we've got right now here. The other thing that I think I'm starting to see more of, and I suspect we'll continue to see more of, is polyamory as an option for characters. That we're getting past the love triangle where it's like a contest between the two rivals over who gets the girl or the guy. And, you know, we've long had like fanfic writers especially going, why not both? Why not both? All of the above? Yeah. So I think we're probably going to see more of that, of it doesn't have to be a like only one person wins in the end kind of mentality.
Which I love. I love that they're forming little unions now. All polycule unions. I definitely want to see more intersection with identities and stuff like that, for sure. Definitely seeing a lot more of it now, but just more. Seeing more. And then maybe a little bit controversial to say, but less gatekeeping would be nice as well. Because we see it a lot, especially in like the social media space, and like authors having to out themselves, even though they don't want to, because, you know, certain people, you know, get maybe offended by something that they've read, and the author has to be like, I'm actually, you know, X, Y, Z. So less of that would be nice as well.
Yeah. I want to ask a few questions from our Q&A box. One of the questions, it moved around a little bit. One of the questions that we had was, who is your favorite POV to write and why? Also, who do you find the most difficult?
That one's interesting because of how Alyssa and I do viewpoint, because it started off with, you know, who was taking point on a scene would be defined by the viewpoint. That, like, if it was a Grey scene, if it was a Vargo scene, actually in some ways if it was any scene other than Ren, Alyssa was usually the one who started it. I still can't really write Tessa's voice properly. Like, Alyssa has that one in their head. I do not quite have it. I think most fun to write, we don't get to do him very often, but Sedge, because he's kind of just like, he's a lovable meathead in some ways. And so the other perspectives, especially like, you know, Red, Grey, Vargo, there's all the like twisty politics and, you know, what do they know and what are they keeping hidden from other people, etc. And then you get to Sedge, and he's just kind of a lovable blunt instrument, and it's a nice change of pace.
Yeah, he's not pretty enough to be a himbo, but, you know, he recognizes his strengths and limitations.
Yeah.
Himbo is basement.
Yeah. And I just have a rollicking good time anytime I get to write Tess, because, like, yeah, she lives in my head very solidly.
And though she doesn't get point of view, Arcady Bones, like any line of Arcady Bones
is amazing.
You can be pretty positive that Alyssa probably wrote anything to do with her, because I don't got that in me.
Yeah, I channel my inner 12-year-old whenever I write her.
I think it's no surprise to anyone to say that Tasia is my favorite to write, just because she's just pure like id, pure like wish fulfillment, basically. Like literally every time it's a Tasia scene, I'm like, all right, so what batshit thing can you possibly do in this chapter? And then just have a ton of fun writing it. And even like in her more like serious solemn scenes, I really like writing too, because she just has such a unique mentality that like I can understand, but is also quite different from mine as well, that it's just kind of like a fun little challenging puzzle. But I also really love writing Angelica because I love tapping into my mean side when I write her. I call her a bitch affectionate because she is. And I just really love how she views the other heirs, especially where she's like, you know, for God's sake, can you please be quiet? You know, that kind of grumpiness that I love in characters so much. I actually have a little bit of trouble with Risha sometimes, just because she is very much not like me. She's very much like rule abiding, you know, intelligent, observant in a way that I'm really not. Like, she just wants to make sure that like everything is like, and even though like I'm not a very, you know, confrontational person, and she's not a very confrontational person, I still feel like this weird like difference between us that makes it hard to like kind of pull her together sometimes, and not make her interesting, because she's a very, you know, interesting character in my humble opinion. But, you know, just making sure that she's staying true to who she is, and not me, the author, wanting her to do something else just because, you know, I maybe want her to do something. She's like, no, this is what I would do. And I'm like, okay, you do what you got to do. And for a side character who does not have a POV, I love writing Paris so much. His voice was just like the greatest in the entire book. I love him.
I'm actually going to add one more shout out at ours, which is Denaya, because frankly, like, middle-aged, fairly no-nonsense woman, like, you know, she's not the kind of character who gets to be centerpiece in a lot of stories. Like, she's a mother with a lot of responsibilities and so on, but I find that in a weird way, of all the characters, who do I have the most like actual personal empathy for? It might be her. Because, you know, I don't have the nerve to do the con artist thing, but okay, I need to figure out how to pay these bills, and oh my god, that person is annoying me so much, like, I can feel her vibe.
Yeah, I love this idea of like, I feel like when I read multiple perspective novels, it's always like, this is a character that I relate to, and this is my aspirational character. You know, like this is who I want to channel on the day, you know, where like nothing's going right, and I just need someone to like possess my body and just like channel, you know, whether that, I don't know, just like channel someone who is just more me, I guess, than I am in normal.
Yeah, there's layers. Who's the most like me? Who do I wish I was like? You know, who is the like oh god, you know, who do I need to channel? It's like, who can I kind of like, can I pull some of that into me somehow?
Mm-hmm. Like
and I think there's also like the I appreciate the characters that have no filters. Like you were talking about, Tara, you were talking about Angelica. And I think for us, that's anytime we need some information to get out there in an info dumpy kind of way, or we you know, there's so many secret keepers. Tonnequist,
yes,
is amazing vehicle for exposing people's secrets.
Yeah.
Because she doesn't have much of a filter, and she'll just say a thing that she's observed, whether you want her to observe that or not.
Yeah, we actually hang a lampshade in the third book on the fact that we have this running pattern of she'll start talking about something and someone will cut her off, because for us as authors, it was useful to have her be like, I'm going to start info dumping at you. And then somebody else is like, okay, moving on. And then we get to that in the third book, we're like, we should acknowledge that actually people have been cutting her off a lot.
Yeah.
So in some ways not good, even if we, the authors, found it hilarious and useful.
Yeah.
Another audience question we have is, did you draw from any queer writers before you?
I mean, the honest answer to that is I have no idea if most of the authors I have read in my life are queer or not.
Yeah.
Like, so yes, probably, but do I know that I'm doing it? It's easier for me to think about it from the standpoint of stories that had like queer characters in them. Like Tara, at the beginning when you were saying you're sort of starting framework for all of your characters, it made me think of the comic book ElfQuest, where basically the default setting for every single elf in that series is polyamorous and bisexual. And like their specific relationship status might be different from that depending on circumstances, but that was just the the home base that everything was starting from, was poly and bi. Like everybody's open to everything. And I think that was one, because I mean I encountered that when I was fairly young, and that got in on a foundational level. I have no idea if Wendy and Richard Pini are queer in any way. I know they've been married for ages, and that is the sum total of my knowledge. But their work certainly got in there.
Yeah, I think fandom was actually more of an influence than actual like books and like actual like canon media, because that was like the only real avenue that I had growing up to like interact with queer stories, was with fandom and fan fiction and stuff like that, and like fan theories, and like, oh, you know, we ship these two characters even though they marry, you know, other people in the canon work, whatever. I think that was the more illuminating experience that I had, where I was like, oh, okay, so I can think about characters in this way. And so that just ended up being how I thought from then on.
I'm going with Tara's answer because, yeah, honestly, I think that especially for kind of, you know, gender and sexual identity and kind of, like I said, you know, I permanent ship goggles attached to my face, that's much more a product of fandom. Although, I mean, I realize looking back that a lot of the books that I thought that I read were a lot less queer than I read them as. I was reading a lot more relationship stuff there than, and a lot more kind of, you know, gender ambiguity there than was probably there intended. Yeah.
Another question we have is, what are some of your favorite queer stories that you've watched or read recently?
Recently? Oh, Our Flag Means Death.
Yeah.
So good. Such an amazing show.
Kin Porsche, which is a Thai show. Yeah.
I'm having that deer in headlights. I always forget to like think about what have I even read or watched recently. I don't know. Nothing. No, that's not true. Like I would have to actually go pull up I keep a list of the books that I've read, and I didn't think to pull that up, so I can't just go consult it now for what I've been reading.
I do have to say that like a very recent read for me was Sharon J. Zhao's Iron Widow.
Yeah.
Which is it's completely gonzo, but it's just awesome. It's a lot of fun, and it was definitely, I had one of those moments because, you know, you kind of have the tightening up of like, oh, I hope she does that. I hope she does that. Is she going to go there? Is she going to go there? And then like, she went there. Yay.
Yeah.
And so, yeah,
I
like that more often, you know, like you were with Our Flag Means Death, more often you don't have to have that tense moment. You can be like, they're going to go there. I'm not reading this wrong. They're really going to go there. And then they do, and you're like, yay.
Yeah. Iron Widow was definitely one where I had that reaction of, I know where I want the story to go. Oh my God, yay, it went there. Like, okay, I'm not going to have that desire thwarted.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think like last weekend, I think I watched probably like 3/4 of Our Flag Means Death in like one day, just back to back instantly.
Very bingeable.
Yeah. It was one of those things where like, I could probably watch another. And then, you know, it like keeps going on and on until you're like, well, now we're season 2, right? Like where's my next one to watch?
Yeah.
Yeah. I do read a lot of Don May, mostly in fan translation. And I have to say, I'm very happy that Seven Seas Don May has now been doing official translations, started publishing official translations right now of Mo Shang Tong Shu's stuff. But they've also got Dumb Husky and his White Cat Shizun by Meat Bun Doesn't Eat Meat.
Yes, I'm very excited to reread that one.
Yes. I've only read as far as the translation, so I'm actually excited to kind of get the rest that I haven't read yet. Yeah.
I had to suffer through a machine translation for the rest of it because I couldn't wait.
I tried. I did like 3 or 4 chapters, and I was just like, I just can't. Can't.
Oh,
so,
yeah.
I was possessed by something, but I just needed to know what happened.
It's a really just Yeah. It's a
That
good
one's
story.
gonzo too. Like
That one's very
absolutely.
gonzo. Yeah. Yeah.
You just got to respect the things that are like, okay, we have lit all the jet engines. You know, we're just going straight at this thing.
I'm like sitting here going, okay, so email Tara afterwards because I really need a friend who's like reading all of this stuff as much as I am. And yeah.
Oh yeah, I've been hyper fixated on these for like at least 2 years now, like since the pandemic started.
Yeah.
Basically.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I read like all the way through Mo Shang Tong Shu's stuff the Christmas before the pandemic hit, and I just kind of like, yeah, have been devouring things since then. Anyway, tangent.
Another question we had was, how do you keep track of plot and characters with multiple POVs? This is such a big question.
It's a good question. I don't know how to answer it.
So since I'm kind of the one who does a lot of the like logistical secretarial work, I guess would be sort of the word for it, for our stuff. You know, multiple different methods. We have a spreadsheet for, and this was partly just so we could keep track of how much we were writing, because we'd set like a minimum for ourselves. That is like each line of the spreadsheet is a scene, and we label it with who the point of view character is, and like a very brief like slug description of it, and then maybe a more detailed one in the next cell over. And it's color coded by point of view, which is very helpful for being able to take in at a glance. It's like, oh, we've actually gone a really long way without having Juna's point of view here. So, you know, is there something, could we like do this scene from her perspective? So that helps. Tara, I think you were saying something about like trying to keep track of, you know, secrets and who knows what and so on. There was a point on the Mask of Mirrors, I think it was, where I had to, or maybe it was when we were working on The Liar's Knot, I had to make a list of like, okay, here's all these pieces of information. Here's who knows them. And in the cases of certain characters like Red, here's which persona of theirs learned that thing. So like, if she learned this thing as Renata, she can't admit to knowing it as Arenza. Who knows that they know that thing? Like, and can they admit to knowing it? Just, you know, this entire list, because I needed to make sure, and I think it was Mask of Mirrors, because we found one place where we had accidentally stabbed ourselves in the back with our own cleverness. Like, we had ruined our plot in a way that took us like half an hour of discussion to figure out how to just like unscrew this whole thing. And it turned out to simply be, we need Ren not to give a name to a certain person at a certain time. As long as she doesn't give her name there, we have solved our problems. But it took
a while to kind of
half an hour of tracing threads, and okay, this goes there and that affects that, and okay, that like this is the kind of plot I would not want to write this without two brains involved to catch each other on our errors and mistakes there. We also have,
because we do, and we do that a lot, where we'll be talking through a particular scene or plot point, or you know, kind of planning whatever we're going next, and we'll check each other on the, okay, that won't work because of, you know, this person knows this, or this has been happening, or what have you. Yeah.
We talk about it as like combing out the tangles, because there's a fair amount of time where we're like, okay, wait, no, we need to stop and go back to like, where did this start? So here's what happened. These following events went like this, and then this person has told the, you know, people about this, and we have to kind of follow that thread. You know, we have textile metaphors in the book, but it's also how we talk about it. We've got to follow that thread through the plot and say, okay, that actually connects with this thing over here, so that's how we can make this plot work, is by having those two things be tied together and make this go. Yeah, like I'll give one example without spoilers for the people who know the Liar's Knot. The whole white sail bit in that book with the letter, that was something where we knew we wanted to cause a threat around that piece of information, and so it was, all right, let's look at all the threads feeding into this. Who would be the person that threat could come from, and then how do we make this conflict go?
And I will say it's a lot of finicky work, but like when it all slots into place, I feel like it's amazing. It goes so well.
Yeah, that moment when we're like, oh, so Stereonovus, that solves all of this for us. Boom. Okay, we're on a roll.
Yeah.
Oh man, sometimes I wish I had a second brain so I can like talk to myself about all this.
Yeah.
It's like for as complicated as my books tend to be, I'm a very disorganized person. because I have ADHD. And so a lot of my things are like in the form of sticky notes or like this random like series of Word documents that I have that have just various notes in them that I do not bother to organize. So I think I was talking to a friend of mine who is very much a Virgo, and
Hi.
Yeah, I can tell.
I don't believe in astrology, and I'm a Virgo. Like these are both true.
This checks out. And she was talking to me about how I color coded my characters, and I said I don't color code, and she was like, "What are you talking about?" Like she was like, "You don't do spreadsheets?" I was like, "No, I don't do any of that." And she was like, how do you write? And I'm like, it just happens. I don't know. I'm sorry. Yeah, my method is just chaos, basically.
Yeah. And I should be clear, like when I talk about all this organization, neither Alyssa nor I work like that separately. When we're working independently, I'm more like you that, you know, I'm scribbling notes to myself on random scraps of paper on my desk. But when there's another person involved, you kind of can't get away with that to the same degree. So collaboration has forced us to be a lot more systematized than we are normally.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's worked for me so far.
Yeah.
Like I feel like the biggest issue with like The City of Dusk book 1 for me was that it took a while to realize what information needed to be dropped when.
Yeah.
So way back in like the early days when it first existed, the big concept at the end, the big climax was something that was already known that they were leading up to, and then it just wasn't working. And so we had to shift it. And then, you know, these other things came in and I had to incorporate some things that I had planned originally for book 2. And so it's like, all right, so when are they going to learn this? And when are they going to learn that? And at one point, one was here and one was here. And then I got to switch them. And then that worked better.
I think it's actually a common problem. I see this particularly when I'm like critiquing stuff from like beginning authors, that they want to save up the cool stuff for later. Like there's often times where the solution is just burn that plot sooner. Like bring it in, make that thing happen, and then trust that that's going to generate more story for you later on. But I've fallen victim to the same thing that I'm like, oh, but I didn't want that to happen until, why am I delaying it? Wait, no, actually it'll work better if I just kind of boom right here at the beginning. Like, there you go.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, this was a big learning point in me learning that for sure. And then because I learned that lesson with this book, when I was writing my next YA, I was like, oh, there's this cool twist that I'm going to keep later. And then literally as I was writing chapter 1, drafting it for the first time, I was like, I need to have it now.
Yep.
The twist has to happen here in chapter 1. What the hell?
Yep. Yeah, once you get that feeling in your head of, wait, no, I could just do the cool thing now, then you can start to distinguish between, because there are some things that you genuinely want to save. Like, there's a bunch of stuff that Alyssa and I drop in book 2 that absolutely needed to be book 2 stuff because it wasn't going to carry the right impact if it didn't have the setup leading up to it. So there are times where you genuinely want to delay something, but when you find yourself going, but now I have like nothing meaty early on, then that might be a hint that you should rearrange.
Yeah. Yeah, I was wondering as you were saying that, that there has to be like a way to discern what are things that make sense to drop sooner and what are things that need more time to build and need more kind of like untangling, unpiecing, or a little bit more, you know, like, I don't know how to describe it. I guess crescendoing, like, you know what I mean? Like building up.
Yeah. There's a lot of metaphors for it because some things need a foundation to stand on. Joe Walton talks about it like with a spear point, that like the spear point needs a spear behind it to like get it into the reader's vitals. You know, so you can think about it by writers have all kinds of metaphors for discussing writing, whatever metaphor works for you. Like it needs more percolation time, you know, whatever, we need more threads going into it. But yeah, I think it's something that a lot of this stuff, you just develop a feel for it the more that you do it. And that's why I think I see that flaw more often among beginning writers, because they don't yet have the instinct developed by doing this sort of thing multiple times. You know, some things you just learn by doing.
I will say that one kind of collection of media that I have found that is a good example of kind of how to get out of that rut is I've noticed with a lot of the K-dramas that I've been watching, they will usually explode their starting premise by about episode 3 or 4. And then it's like everything that comes after is like developing off of that. And I just find it very interesting that structurally you can almost guarantee that they're going to, the thing that in a US show would be, this is the end of season 1, or this is the overarching kind of just status quo that we're constantly fighting against. They just knock that stuff off in like 3 or 4 episodes and move on to the what else comes next. Yeah.
And some of that is like the genre conventions, because if you're watching a K-drama and if you watch several of them, then you know to expect, okay, what I'm getting at the outset is just kind of like the pilot light that's going to start the actual fire of the plot. Whereas if you're not expecting that, because this wasn't like 3 or 4 episodes in, but the TV show Alias, I remember I was watching it, I was enjoying it, and halfway through season 2, the show basically went, psych, you thought this was the main plot of the show, but it turns out it's actually about this other thing. And I went, I'm not interested in that other thing. I was here for your original premise, and now I don't care anymore, and I quit. So it can feel like a bait and switch if the audience isn't primed to expect it, or if the initial premise was the one they were more invested in.
Yeah. Well, and I think also if it's about switching premises rather than dealing with like the outcome of that we're not
changes status quo. Equivalent of, rather than having it be a romance where the whole thing is will they, won't they, early on you go, yes they will, and now there are fallouts that happen because of this.
Yeah. A show that I think does that kind of switcheroo actually really well is The Good Place, because you get the initial twist premise that you think is the twist right at the beginning, and you're like, okay, I got to see what the fallout of this is, and then of course by the end of season 1 you realize what the actual twist was. And I love that kind of stuff, because it's like the kind of thing that they give enough clues that you can figure it out on your own. But even if you don't, it's like, if you do or if you don't, it's still very satisfying.
And that initial twist is enough of an engine on its own to keep things going. It's not like you're treading water waiting for things to actually get interesting.
Yeah.
All right, we are almost out of time, and I think we just ran wildly off topic, but I enjoyed it anyway.
Yeah, I know. I was trying to find a question that was like really quite
something brief,
like and easy to answer. I think
let's sum everything up.
Yeah. Maybe I have one that's maybe easy to answer and like quick. What if we do like what were some of your earliest experience you had with queer fantasy main characters? I know we maybe talked a tiny bit about it, but like if we can just like say 1 or 2.
Yeah, I think alongside ElfQuest, and this one I think was formative for a lot of people in my general age bracket, Mercedes Lackey's Vaniel trilogy.
Yep. Literally my answer.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I think for me, Meredith Ann Pierce's Dark Angel trilogy, which for the majority of it, the romance is between Ariel and Irilaf, who's the kind of emo male vampire thing. But there's this thread of deep sisterhood friendship with Ariel and Aaron, who's a girl that she meets up with, and I apologize if I'm spoiling this, but also the book's been out for like 30 years or so. It ends with Ariel basically telling Irilaf, yeah, sorry, I'm done with your stuff. And her and Aaron going off to basically recreate the decaying world that's been decaying all around them. So it ends with like Ariel and Aaron being together. And that was unusual and powerful for me. I know also for me, I think, like I was saying earlier, I was reading a lot of queerness into text that wasn't there. Like I was really into ballet growing up. And there's this one ballet called Coppelia, and it's about a girl, Swanilda, whose fiance falls in love with this life-size doll, and hijinks ensue. And I have this whole other mental version of that, where when Swanilda goes to take the place of the doll to confront her boyfriend, instead she finds out the doll is like alive, and they fall in love and they run off together and have girl adventures. And I'm actually noodling around with the series of linked novellas that would be like Coppelia and Odette and Odile getting together, and a trans Little Mermaid, and the Nutcracker Prince and the Rat King being enemies to lovers. And yeah, I basically just a bunch of the famous story ballets all queered up after going out on the town. Yeah.
I'd also throw an interview with a vampire.
Yes.
Very formative for me personally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's a really great note to end on. And also, I really love this idea of like queer ballet novellas.
Melissa needs to write those just for me. The rest of you can have them too, but I want them.
Thank you so much to everyone, all these authors for chatting with us today. Thank you to the audience members for submitting questions. I'm sorry we didn't get all of them. There are a few that were just like a little bit too much to answer in like 2 minutes. So sorry about that.
I apologize for digressing.
Yeah. And thank you also to Orbit for organizing this event, also the entire like Pride event series. I just wanted to remind everyone obviously to buy the books using the link below at the bottom. And also just a little reminder, the next event in the Pride series is Friday at 2 p.m. Eastern, 7 p.m. UK time with science fiction authors Alex White and KB Wagers, and it's moderated by Candace, the owner of Tubby and Coos. So maybe everyone would put that on their calendar. And I hope everyone has a really great day, and just many thanks to everyone for chatting with us and spending this time together.
Well, thank you for moderating. Is that the right word for this? Thank you for your good questions.
Yes, thank you.
All right, bye everybody.
Great.
Bye.